Cool. So recording, just got to wait for folks to start coming through. Got Elizabeth Lane who's joined. Welcome, Elizabeth. Joel's just joined. Let us know where you are joining from as well in the chat, just as we look to kick things off. But in the first instance, good morning everyone. Casey here from Kiwi Landing Pad, and now called Territory 3, just gone through a rebrand, which is cool. And today joined by James Fuller from Hnry. Pleasure to have you on. I'm very excited to dive into your founder story, James. I think if we wait just a wee moment before we really kick things in. Oh, we've got Brandon tuning in from Canada. He, good friend, used to be based here in Wellington and moved back to Canada. So as they tune in, James, how did your story begin?
Wow, good question. So I suppose like the way I would best describe myself is I'm a reformed management consultant. So I spent a number of years working with the likes of Deloitte and others doing consulting work. And yeah, just have always had a little bit of an entrepreneurial streak, but never really done anything about it. You know, kind of consider myself a bit more of a hobbyist, I suppose. This whole thing started just from personal pain of, you know, back in 2014, 2015, my co-founder and I left our salaried jobs and started out as contractors. And yeah, we're just totally blown away by just the amount of admin that independent professionals have to deal with. And the kind of, you know, the old school nature of things of like having to find a traditional accountant and then get training on how to use accounting software that you then have to pay for. And yeah, so we started Hnry. I always describe it as being like a hobby that got out of hand, but it was very much about like solving personal pain at the starting point, you know, many years ago. It was like, actually, how can we navigate this world of being contractors when, you know, it all seems like the whole world is stacked up against people who work independently.
And for those tuning in and unfamiliar with Hnry, although I'm sure you all are, very much about liberating Kiwis from the responsibilities of tax and having to do it yourself, whereas Hnry can do it for you, right? So in the same sort of way where normally if you're an independent contractor, you have to go through all the kind of PAYE and KiwiSaver and student loan, all that sort of stuff, which is an absolute headache. Essentially, your payments go to Hnry and then you handle all of that, so you can actually just focus on what you're really good at.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, when you're self-employed, you're kind of responsible for everything from kind of payments, so tax payments, tax calculations, tax filings, and even go and get a traditional accountant, you're still having to do a lot of the work yourself. You know, you still, if you use accounting software, have to sit there and reconcile and categorize your transactions. So I suppose the crux of the idea behind Hnry is how do you bring together those three worlds of accounting software, payments, and professional services accountancy into a single place and provide an all-in-one service that's on a pay-as-you-go basis that takes care of all the financial admin that comes from being an independent earner, allowing you to, as you say, on working with your clients and doing what you do, knowing that you're always up to date on all of your taxes and filings.
Yeah, gotcha. And now you guys are the fastest growing tax agency throughout Australasia. You're doing really well. You're got thousands of folks that you're liberating from that workload so they can focus on what they're doing. James, when this started, so like you originally you're kind of in senior role for Thomson Reuters, you're senior role with Deloitte. Then you jumped across to Creative HQ, where you're working as an independent contractor, helping with all things startup, agile, lean, all that sort of great stuff, customer focus. Obviously, that jump meant that you became responsible for those sorts of things, whereas previously, as probably the nature of an employee, you didn't have to worry about them, and that headache sort of came. Before all of this, though, you're an app developer.
Yeah, that was my, way back in the day, that was my, when I came out of uni, I graduated with I think at the time it was called computation, which is today is probably called like computer science. But yeah, I started off my career, actually I left university and swore that I'd never touch code again because I was sick. And I was like, I've had enough, like, it's just not for me. And then I spent like 3 months working as a field sales assistant on the phone, and then I did like 3 months in a billing department at a phone company, and ironically found myself finding technical solutions to problems I would come up against as a sales assistant, and ended up leaving those roles and joined a company where I was doing kind of technical support and then app development. But realistically, that's like, I suppose that's always been a passion of mine, is like technology, but I don't think I'm quite smart enough to be like a full-time engineer. I think I look at the stuff that our team does now, and those guys are just absolute wizards. And I just think I know enough to be dangerous, but probably a lot of my knowledge is like a little bit out of date now. But yeah, I started my career doing technology development projects, and kind of went from there to doing sort of business analysis roles to project management, and then into consulting.
And when you're going through these pain points yourself of like, you're now an independent contractor and you've got all these tax obligations. So you built something yourself to actually scratch your own itch. What did that look like?
So, I mean, it all started with just this, when you're working independently, one of the biggest concerns is that you never know how much money is actually yours. You get paid by your clients, and you know that you're supposed to retain some of that for tax. And usually the sort of generally held view from the old school accounting community was you tuck away 33% for income tax, which just as a side note is just such it's just such a pointless, arbitrary number. Like if you actually look at, and I don't want to talk about tax because it's super dreary, don't get me wrong, like, it's not business, but like I'm not an accountant, I find it tedious, which is why we built Hnry. But if you look at the tax rates, it is nigh on impossible to achieve a tax rate of 33% income tax. You can earn $2 million a year and you're not going to pay 33% of your income in tax. But you kind of come up against this thing as a contractor where you get given this really old school kind of arbitrary advice. And for us, myself and my co-founder, it was that big struggle of actually how much of our money is ours and how much goes to tax. So we just started with a couple of spreadsheets, and we said, well, look, this will solve our problem, is that we'll start to calculate out how much we're earning, start to work out how much tax that we actually need to keep, and then how much we can spend. And we had no intentions of starting a business out of it. It was more just because there was a pain point that we were trying to solve for ourselves to make our own lives easier. And it was only when we had a couple of friends came out of salaried work and they started contracting, and they said to us, hey, look, you guys have been contractors for a few years. How do you do this? And we said, well, look, we've got spreadsheets. We'll put you through the spreadsheets. And as I say, this is why I kind of talk about it being like a hobby that got out of hand, is that they then told friends who told friends. And the next thing you do, we were sitting there going, hang on a minute, like maybe we're not as dumb as we think we are. Maybe no one actually solved this problem properly for contractors, which is why we've got a bunch of people who want to use these spreadsheets. So yeah, I mean, literally, in that classic lean startup sense, we took these spreadsheets. I created a one-page WordPress website that was, I look back on it now and it just looked terrible. It just looked like it was so dreary and awful. And it had the tagline, "We pay your taxes." And it was just like the most clickbaity thing you've ever seen. But it was a way of testing and validating the market. But back in those early days, kind of 4 or 5 years ago, it was literally a one-page website and a handful of spreadsheets to see whether or not we could actually get some traction.
Yeah, that's so cool. Like actually double down on whether you're adding value, and then build something if it is adding value, opposed to getting carried away and building something without letting it see sunlight.
Yeah, it's so hard because having kind of worked with a lot of startups prior to Hnry, and as a sort of working with a Creative HQ and working in the startup community, like you would always talk to founders and say, look, you should be able to, like within reason, you should be able to sell your product with effectively a one-page website, an email address, a phone number, a person, and the Google suite. Like you should be able to go and sell that product and have someone understand the value of it to purchase that product. And if it means you're having to do things in the background manually in order to deliver that product and deliver that service, that's the kind of pain you need to wear in order to validate what it is you need to build. Because, we always talk about, we build this product for the customers. We don't build it for ourselves. So unless you're actually customer led in terms of what they'd like to see and how they'd like to use it, you're just kind of using your own experience to hypothesize what they might like. And that's where you get to that problem that you're constantly unpicking mistakes that you've made because you made assumptions about a particular customer group that didn't turn out to be true.
So practically, what did that look like for you? So you've got like a bunch of friends that have started using this. It's growing into this manual process, which, as you say, there's pain involved for you to administrate it, but it's a way that you can have it immediately in market and be adding value. How did you engage those customers to get the feedback? What did that kind of process look like?
Yeah, so it was, the process itself, and I look back at it now and it's crazy to think of, but, in those early days, the website, the functionality that was there was nothing special. There was no automation. Basically, it was a few pages of forms where you could only have one client at a time, and invoicing basically meant you filled in a form, and behind the scenes I would make an invoice manually and send it on your behalf. Like all of this stuff, like we didn't do any tech. Someone signed up for the service, and basically the website would send me an email and I would paste their details into my spreadsheet. Like that's kind of where we started. So what it looked like in the super early days was overhead. But at the same time, like I still had a job, I still had a day job. This was, you don't, unless you've got some certainty around whether this is going to be a thing, you don't literally jack in all of your responsibilities and throw yourself into it and go, I've never made a cent off this idea, but I need to quit my job and spend next 3 months proving it. You go, well, how do I work around my current job to kind of to determine whether or not this is something worth pursuing? So it was all about early validation. And yeah, we kind of supported customers just through email. We kind of did as much manual work as required to get things off the ground, but at the same time we would constantly engage with customers. And these early adopters, some of them are still with us today, which is unbelievable. We were charging 3 times as much for the service back then. Our service fees were 3 times as much. They weren't capped either. So some people were spending significant amounts of money with us. And so we were constantly in contact with them about what they liked, what they didn't like. They would come to us and say, my client has this requirement, or, this is the sort of thing that I need to be able to do. And I mean, one of the beautiful things about New Zealand consumers is that they're so comfortable with things that are rough around the edges and with supporting the little guy. And you do get an engaged customer base who are willing to kind of wear a whole bunch of pain, because the problem we were solving for them was so great that they didn't need to know, but they didn't really care that the invoices got sent manually by me. They were like, well, actually, I get my problem solved. Whether you have automation in the background is kind of down to you. But they were a very kind of vocal customer group who would feed back in about, here's the feedback my client has, or here are the things that you could do, or here's some great suggestions. And certainly in those early days, that was so valuable, just to have almost just two-way conversation with customers. You know exactly who they are, what they do, you have a rapport with them, that you have a conversation, you talk to them on the phone, and you're about understanding their needs and building the product for them.
That's so cool. And then I guess to your point as well of like that validation piece and figuring out where you need to double down to add the most value, it would be nearly impossible to kind of sit by yourself or your team without those engagements and actually try and think up what those challenges could be. And you go down all sorts of weird rabbit holes. So key message in there is just make sure you're engaging with your customers and get it in their hands as soon as possible so they can stress test it and help kind of co-create next iterations with you, opposed to you thinking, or a founder thinking that they know it all and they know what's going to be the next step.
Yeah. And look, you're always going to make mistakes, right? I think with our first iteration of the WordPress website, I think even the terminology we used was so biased towards people who worked in similar industries like us. So for instance, we started this thing off, we would consider ourselves like independent contractors. And so a lot of the terminology we used was about contracts. And we would say, you have a contract term that runs from X date to Y date. And that was probably, it wasn't a huge mistake because we didn't see the impacts because we didn't have the volume of customers, but certainly very quickly we found ourselves kind of unpicking some of the terminology when we started to pick up people who ran e-commerce stores, or people who didn't need to invoice at all because they were getting paid by Uber, or people who were freelancers that didn't have a set contract. They were kind of working more ad hoc. And so, if we could have built this whole platform based on our own assumptions of what the market was, but by almost doing the exact opposite, not building anything until we had a good enough base of customers to know enough about them and to know enough about their routines that we could build something that was genuinely valuable. That mistake around terminology could have been much, much worse if we hadn't actually just waited. And we see so many people jump in and go, I need to build the all singing, all dancing product that does everything, and then I can launch it. But it's that, the classic quote of like, if you're not embarrassed by your MVP, then you're too late to the market,
Absolutely. So what did the ramp up look like? So after you started getting some traction behind you, you've got paying customers, you've got this really strong dynamic with relationship customers, you can jump on the phone and all that great stuff. What did the journey look like to going towards your first investment into Hnry and that side of the journey?
So, I mean, I think we bootstrapped probably for a year and a half, maybe. And, we didn't see significant customer growth, but it was all about validation. It was all about testing different ways of doing digital marketing. And, you know, when I say testing digital marketing, I'm like, we chuck $100 into Twitter and see what happens. Like, you know, these weren't like super scientific tests and the kind of things we do now, but just trying to evolve this thing. It was almost like, you know, we always kind of have these kind of phrases that we would be kind of asking ourselves, like right at the start when we had 2 customers, we're like, oh, this is fun. This is like a fun thing. And then sort of a few more people would sign up and you'd go, oh, I wonder if this is a thing for people. I wonder if this is something that could actually solve people's problem. And then, you know, and literally, because you're not putting a whole lot of money in, because we didn't, you know, we maybe put like 10 grand in or something just to float the business to start off with. But we kind of weren't really making much money, but you get a little way down the line and you go, actually, I think this could be a thing. Like, I think I've got enough confidence that this could be a thing. And then it was almost late 2017 when the applications came out for the second round of the FinTech Accelerator through Creative HQ that I'd been a coach of the year before. And I remember sort of turning to the others and going, I think we should apply. Like, I think this is enough of a thing. We've got enough money coming in. There's enough traction here that we could actually go and apply for this FinTech Accelerator. And, you know, I said, look, I will go unpaid. I'll quit my job at Creative HQ and go to the other side of the desk and be a you know, part of the cohort rather than part of the coaching team. And we said, look, if we do 3 months of the accelerator and it doesn't work, then at least we've scratched that itch. But we can't continue on working like 60-hour weeks and all this kind of stuff, grinding away, if this isn't going to be an idea that's worth pursuing. And so it was worth the sacrifice of obviously going unpaid. And I think in the end I went unpaid for like 6 months or something, but it was worth it, because we took on a little bit of investment through convertible notes before the FinTech Accelerator, and then a little bit during, and then afterwards we were actually able to go for a kind of first proper capital raise in 2018. But yeah, that kind of started us off on that funding journey. But the only reason that we could ever go down that road was because we already had traction, and we'd almost basically done over a full year and a half before we even went and asked for any money. And whilst the numbers we were bringing in were low, it showed kind of cohorts, it showed consistency, it showed LTV, you know, rather than you know, I think it's really difficult. And I think that some businesses have been super successful about just generating a massive wait list and going, here are the people who are interested in our product. But I think particularly for what we do as a business, with trust being such a high element, we actually have to show repeated customers paying over time, almost a full financial year, before we could get investors to take it seriously as something that wasn't just going to be a flash in the pan.
Got it. And when you end up doing the capital raise, this is after obviously you did the pre-seed or some convertibles in there.
Yeah.
What about when you did your seed round? What sort of size are we talking? How much did you end up scaling the team? What sort of pains and learnings happened during that journey?
Good question. Yeah, so I think 2018, we brought on maybe like 80K of convertible notes in early 2018, like just shortly before and when we were going through the FinTech Accelerator. And then I think we came back of that and we probably raised around 800, maybe 850. I mean, it was a super oversubscribed round. We kind of only assumed that we would raise like 500. And it was a stressful experience, right? Because you have literally no leverage. Like however much you're making in MRR at the time, particularly in New Zealand, there's like a genuinely sort of widely held belief about how much your business should be valued at in those early stages. And, you know, you're kind of coming up against basically like institutional angel investors who go, no, this is all I'm going to value you at, regardless of the long-term prospects of the business. And so it's super challenging. We had investors kind of come in and say that they were going to sort of put 6 figures in, and then 6 figures turned into 5 figures. And we had large corporates come and say that they were going to put 6 figures in. And off the back of that, a load of other people got interested. And then, you know, something happens in the corporate and their risk appetite changes and they go, now we're not going to put this in. And like, it's very difficult. You know, that round probably took us about 4 or 5 months end to end, and took me away from the business significantly at a time when our team was, I don't know, like 3-4 people maybe. And, you know, we had a little bit of money from the convertible notes that was keeping us going. I remember one day we just moved into the kind of small corner of this office that we're in now and shortly about to move out of. We kind of knocked through into a bigger space and now we've filled it. But I remember we were in this tiny like corner office. There were about 4 of us in the business, 4 or 5 of us. And I remember looking at the bank account as we were raising, and we literally had like 2 or 3 grand in the bank account, and payroll was coming up. And we knew the round was in its later stages, but you're actually at that point where suddenly it becomes very real when you might have to ask staff to forego wages for like 2-3 weeks whilst you get the money settled from a capital raise. So yeah, it's a very difficult bit when you're starting out. It's never a smooth process. And I mean, you don't know what you don't know. And I would say, like, as founders, we probably sat there in the early days and went, oh, we're pretty sure how this works. But man, you just don't know how investment works until you get into it.
Yeah, and that sort of pressure as well, knowing that people are dependent on you and they've got family that are dependent on them, that weight must have been absolutely massive. And I guess also lighting a fire under you to like say, what can I do to accelerate the process? But of course, there's only so many things within that's in your control. It's also a case of letting it take its process.
Yeah, and you got to take on a lot of feedback as well, and you've got to talk to other people who've been through the same situation. And that it's interesting. I don't think we could have done anything that differently, because as I say, I don't think in that first early round we necessarily had any leverage. But as you start to build that position of leverage, you're actually able to discount more of the sort of speculative interest that comes your way. Like I remember in 2018, we got an opportunity to pitch at the Flux Accelerator up in Auckland. That had just finished. We kind of pitched last. It was like I remember that was such a stressful experience. Like I'm not great when it comes to public speaking. Like I'm great if I don't have a script, but you give me a script and a time limit and I'm a total wreck. And I remember like I was on last that night and I was literally nil by mouth for the entire like 4 or 5 hours preceding it. I'd spent the whole day in a hotel room memorizing this pitch. We did the pitch of the night. It was great. It went really, really well. And I ended up with like 120 email addresses that were like, oh, these are all people who've expressed interest. And, as a founder in those early stages, like that looks great. But then suddenly you realize the reality of like, I've got to send 120 emails and pursue 120 leads, of which
all the time
maybe like 2 or 3 actually came off. Whereas as soon as you've got more leverage, you can literally sit there and go, look, either you're interested or you're not, I don't want to waste my time on this thing. So it's almost like the inverse of the earlier you are, it's so much harder to raise and it's so much harder to know what to pursue and what to discount. Whereas, we've had 2 subsequent raises since then that have actually been a lot smoother because they haven't needed us to be so kind of like desperate to prove ourselves.
Even we're just talking off call, like your most recent raise was rapidly accelerated, like with a condensed kind of almost a 6-week period, if I heard you correctly.
Yeah, it was 6 weeks end to end, and it was kind of unexpected. We still had some runway, and we were looking to raise July this year. We kind of had all these plans in place, and then I was talking to one of our investors in November, and obviously we've launched in Australia kind of during 2020, and we said like this is our raise our cap plan. This is the cap strategy. And I remember we were having coffee around the corner from here, and he said, well, why wouldn't you just raise more money and go faster and just raise now? And I'm like, well, because the traditionally held belief is that raising money in November is just like the dumbest idea because the whole business world shuts down towards Christmas. And I remember him saying to me like, oh, I think you can do it. I think you could raise before the end of the year. And so yeah, we just went, all right, okay, we'll just go for it. Like we kind of got a fire underneath us and said, look, why can't we raise quickly? And so yeah, we galvanized the shareholders, we got everyone moving, and yeah, 6 weeks later we'd raised 4.1 mil from existing shareholders.
This is like 1-2 weeks from Christmas sort of thing.
Yeah, 1-2 weeks from Christmas. We could have easily oversubscribed that round by a whole lot more. But yeah, it was just that thing of, compared to our first ever round that took months and months and the slaving of due diligence and everything else, it just shows that once you've got that traction and you can have so much more excitement behind you that, I think we raised that 4.1 mil off the back of, and obviously everyone had board reports and various updates, but the actual kind of shareholder update to get that investment was a 2-page, 3-page overview of where the business was at with a few stats and some commentary. And I think it's so different from, I think our first 2 capital raises, we had like a tome of an IM that everyone needed to read through and understand. And there was questions and diligence meetings and everything else. Whereas it's just become a little bit easier now that, we can control the narrative a little bit more about how and when we raise.
That's so fascinating. Folks, everyone listening, if you do have questions, do make sure you put them in the Q&A case or in the chat, and James and I'll be happy to circle around to them. Also, I think what we could probably do towards the end as we dive fully into Q&A, if you're bold enough, I'd be happy to invite you up on screen and you could even ask the question directly yourself. But I guess very much a safe environment to kind of ask the things that are most meaningful for you for where you're at on your journey, and get James's perspective on it. James, taking us back to so you've raised this 850. You've gone from this 2 to 3K in the bank sort of stress as you're looking to close things off, and you finally get that through. Term sheets come, they get signed, money's in the bank. What strategy look like? How does this change the game for you, and how did you approach the next kind of, I guess, 3 to 6 months?
Well, it all became when we raised, we kind of, you have to kind of put a bit of a story about why you're raising. And for us, it was about, we've got this product. There's a huge amount of manual cranking that needs to happen in the background. We're basically raising to scale, but we're also raising to automate. And so we always talk about kind of operating at the rev limit of what we can actually take from a manual perspective, because,
Interesting.
Being able to sort of see ahead and go, okay, if customer numbers get to blah, then this manual process that's like inconsequential for us now is going to start being detrimental. So back in those days, it was, as I say, we were doing manual banking payments on a daily basis, a few times during the day. And that's fine when you've got like 100 customers, because the frequency of payments isn't that huge. But, even getting to the point of feeling stretched of like doing 80 payments a day manually into internet banking, you start to go, okay, this is great, but how do we automate this? And there's always a technology solution to the problem. So the kind of sort of post-raise, the big thing for us was, how do we automate the things that we've been doing manually? Now that we're so used to them being kind of manual processes, how do we start to reduce cost to serve? Because then you can kind of, off the back of a raise, you can go, well, the reason we're raising is because margins are currently sitting at X, but with the right automation, we can actually significantly increase margins, increase automation, deliver mobile apps, all this other stuff. And so it almost became about, when you see that red line of the rev limiter coming, you want to be able to shift gears and go, okay, and now we can go even faster, and now we can go even faster. But because we were building from an MVP base, you have to be able to kind of scale the tech and the platform alongside customers. So we sort of have this thing of like, we go acquire a whole bunch of customers, and then you can start to see where existing manual processes might in the future start to crack. And you go, okay, so now we're at a point where we need to start, automating this bit and this bit. And then you have, now at the point we are now, where actually everything's pretty significantly automated, and what we see are less kind of scaling challenges around manual processes, and more around how do we go and position this product in different markets or in into different industries. But sort of number one thing that we raised for back in the day was, we've got to stop this reliance on one person having to process payments manually and do these kind of manual pay runs. And now I look at the kind of volume of payments that we do, and it's frightening how many payments we're doing on a daily basis, to think that that used to be me literally into the internet banking, copy paste. It's like we're doing, I don't know, I think it's like $200 million a year through our accounts. It's like, oh my God, just back in those days of like having to
wouldn't do that manually.
it comes back pretty strong.
Yeah, 100%. We've got a question I think you mostly answered, but just in case you want to add anything else to it. How did you know that you knew enough to build a product to stop doing things manually? And maybe if I added a piece onto that, how did you triage what you worked on? Some things obviously going to be easier than others. Some things are more important. As you kind of pointed out just before, some things may not be a problem now, but they become very detrimental later. Did you have a process for how you tackled that?
Yeah, I mean, we've always been incredibly like data informed as a business. So we would look at, over the course of a week, in a super like pared back and lean way, like how many times does a certain thing happen and how long does it take? This wasn't some kind of detailed time and motion study. This was, oh, hey, we've had this customer question has come up 3 times this week. And like I'd always, we'd have like little post-its on our monitors that we just put like a little check mark next to it to say, oh, this thing's come up again. Or, today I ended up spending probably 2 hours doing manual payments. And then you equate that to the number of customers you've got, and you kind of, you start to trend that out and go, okay, if we acquired 5 times as many customers, suddenly the manual effort is going to be absolutely detrimental to the business. And that's that kind of rev limiter model. It's like, how do you, rather than kind of go, here is this one point where we go, yep, we know enough, now we can automate everything. It's actually, what's the most important thing that we can look to automate now that will reduce the manual effort burden, will reduce cost to serve, will increase margins. And there are things that we waited like 2 years fully automate, because the volume that we were doing of those things at the time was not significantly detrimental and was actually super manageable. But then you start to look at, once you have a good handle on the stats around your cost to serve, you go, well, you start to get to a point where you start to equate number of customers to number of people required to support those customers. And then you can kind of trace out over time and say, look, I don't want a whole kind of warehouse full of people churning manual tasks like mechanical Turks. Like, we want to get, where are the bits that we can chip away at over time, with the strategic goal being getting to like 95, 98% automated, which is kind of where we are today.
And during all this process, how many developers other than yourself were originally on the team, and how much emphasis did you have to put on building out the dev side to start automating those processes?
So January 2018, we hired an external contractor to replace my beautifully created WordPress website. We hired him to come in, and I think we paid him like 8K or 7K or something, and he did it over Christmas in between other jobs, to build a kind of Ruby on Rails version of Hnry, like super basic, super pared back. But beginning of 2018 in the accelerator, we just had me. It was me full time. I probably wasn't in a position to do any development because I don't know any Ruby on Rails. So we had to use the investment from the accelerator to go and find a developer. And so got Seb, who literally just turned up on holiday from France and needed some work and knew a little bit of Ruby on Rails. And so in that classic style, like I remember interviewing him, and then right at the end I was like, yeah, so when can you start? And I was like, oh crap, I should probably ask my co-founder whether or not they want to as well. It was like such a bizarre old situation. But yeah, so we couldn't afford anyone apart from Seb and myself. So doing all the original build was mostly during the accelerator. I was doing all the customer support, Seb was doing some build work. We had a number of advisors. I kind of assembled, and I'm not sure how usual this was for the accelerator, I assembled a technical advisory board. So we reached out to a bunch of very smart kind of architecture tech people and just said, look, would you be free to give up some time, an hour a week maybe, to come in and hear about some of the technical challenges and help to solve problems? And so at the time, I didn't really tell anyone this, but I kind of saw it as like a long form interview, that if you had 5 tech people that started in that group, you could then assess who was genuinely bought into what we were doing, so that when we raised money, those were the people you could approach and say, do you want to come on full time? And that's what we did with Michael, who's our first CTO, who he was almost the last person standing in that technical advisory board, and had been working closely with Seb just once a week for an hour, just helping him out. And yeah, I think it was almost after the demo day presentation, I think he came to me and said, look, if there's roles going, I would be interested. And so yeah, from that point on, it was about how do we build a sustainable kind of tech presence in the business. And I don't remember when it was that I stopped doing development, but I still have a bit of a tinker around here and there. But from Michael coming on to building a bit of a team, it was all about kind of building up that capability within the business.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love that strategy, and I suppose that even if they hadn't come on as part of the team, like even just the input in those early stages on making sure you're going in the right direction, you're not creating a whole lot of unnecessary technical debt or pushing through problems faster, like that in itself would have been a win. But I love that extra layer of like actually scouting talent to join too.
Yeah, it's something that and I don't know whether Creative HQ did this deliberately, and I see that Laura is on the call, so maybe Laura can chip in with whether or not this was a thing that was known. But I always felt that Creative HQ, when I was working there, almost had a similar option. They would bring on independent contractors for periods of time to assist them in various things, almost as a way of trialing them out, of going, actually, we can trial this person out and see how they work and how they do workshops. And then if that person is going to be beneficial to the organization, we can try and take them on a more full-time basis. Because that's how I got started at HQ. I was helping them do some random work. I think back on probably Lightning Lab XX back in the day when I first met Laura, that was just me giving up some free time to come and do advisory board stuff. And then you start to get a little more kind of involved and a little closer and a little closer. And then eventually they say, do you want to come and actually do some more full-time work? So I kind of, whether that was the intent, but I've kind of learned it from that there's there are opportunities if people are engaged enough to kind of have a long form job interview to see if people were actually going to work well within the team.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess it kind of ties in with that saying of hire slowly, fire quickly, which is really hard for people to do in practice. But because you get so excited, I know this with my experience with my startup in Dunedin. Like anytime someone had an opportunity to bring someone on board, like I just like immediately saw all the great things and where they'd slot in, all this sort of stuff. And I almost got emotional about like the extra rallying of people behind it, opposed to trying to really take it slow, make sure they're the right fit sort of thing. Because obviously then as you go further down, you start to run into challenges. You want to make sure you've got the right people on the team that do have the buy-in. So it's a tough thing. I love that strategy, man. That's super cool. How big's the team now?
I think we're 27. Yeah, we've got like a bunch of roles open at the moment. So yeah, we're always like our hiring strategy, like you say, it's really difficult because I think, you know, we've always been very protective of the culture of Hnry. And, you know, one of the things we always say is when it comes to hiring, you know, we're not hiring an army, we're hiring Navy SEALs. Like we don't want to kind of grow so quickly that we lose sight of what quality looks like for our staff and kind of hit a bunch of inefficiencies of things. So actually we're very deliberate, and whilst we kind of have a relatively rapid process for hiring, it's very detailed, and it's very like we've learned from being burnt in the past, like actually how do we hire properly and how do we make sure that we're bringing people in for the right reasons and that we're not rushing to hire someone because we want to fill a gap or we get excited, like you say, but actually that they're going to be a long-term kind of strategic member of the team. And, you know, for us, that means that we're at like 27 at the moment. I think we hired 5 people in a week last month. I mean, so we started to push sort of a bit harder and started to open up the taps, but it's been a really exciting thing to get from where we were kind of a year and a bit ago, where you kind of have this incremental hiring thing, to actually starting to hire in cohorts and start to bring people in sort of 4 or 5 at a time, and particularly growing a team out in Australia now, trying to actually kind of get people in and embedded in the culture as a group, rather than sort of having this kind of sporadic thing that we've done previously, which is, you know, people can sort of apply for jobs at any time and we'll pick up good people and bring them in, but being a bit more deliberate about how we hire so that we don't get to that. You know, we end up with a whole load of people that I don't know their names and they don't really know why they're here, and it's just a job, because everyone here is here because they like helping people. And I think that's what you know I love about working here, is actually everyone here has a story as to why Hnry is something that means a lot to them, and that kind of means that you get a lot of people who are just genuinely committed to, you know, delivering value, rather than, you know, I don't think there's anyone here who would say that this is just a job for them.
I love that. Yeah, purpose sits behind it, which ultimately people are happier, they enjoy it, they build deeper relationships. But they also want to do more meaningful work, and the quality of the work and all that sort of kind of stuff compounds together. We've got a question from Laura, which is, what's the strategy for Hnry for the next 12 to 18 months? What are you aiming to achieve next, and how will you go about it? Thanks for your question, Laura.
Big strategy for us is obviously having launched in Australia late last year. We have our new head of Australia starts on Monday, which is just so exciting. So building a team out in Australia is a big thing. We're starting to really see a lot of traction in that market at the moment. And, you know, moving into a new market, you know, we talked about investment strategy a bit earlier, being able to talk about, yes, we've got a really great kind of scaling business here in New Zealand, but if we can show the same thing in the Australian market, which is starting to see the early shoots of, then that stands us in really good stead for then going to a subsequent market. And so actually early 2022, we'll start looking in exactly the same way as we did when we selected the Australian market, which is we go out to a bunch of markets with a, you know, a Facebook ad and throw $1,000 behind it for pre-registrations to see whether or not anyone bites and whether it's of interest. And you do literally no work at all to put anything together. You just let Facebook and the algorithm determine whether or not people are interested. And yeah, people sort of click and sign up with their email address and say, yep, let me know when this arrives. You can then compare almost the pre-registration acquisition cost across a multiple set of markets, and then make a decision about, okay, based on, you know, cost of pre-registration, where do we think is most sort of suitable to examine from an economic perspective and various other things. So yeah, we assessed a few different markets, ended up with Australia and the UK were the two that we tested most heavily in kind of early 2019, I think it was. And we were picking up pre-registrations for like $6 a pre-registration. In the end, it became like an economic and more of a proximity decision around going to Australia, but we're intending to probably run the same thing later this year, early next year in a bunch of different shortlisted markets to then be able to say, okay, so now we've proven New Zealand, we're starting to scale well in Australia. What's that next cab off the rank? And that next cab off the rank, maybe actually we're just going to double down on Australia because it's such a big market. There's, you know, there's no need to overstretch ourselves at any point. It's more about saying, you know, what's the right logical move rather than, you know, being kind of tied to this idea that in order to be successful, you have to scale into every single country in the world. Because actually we could be a huge business just in New Zealand. And Australia is 10 times the size from an independent earner market perspective. It's about being sensible so that you don't end up, you know, chasing a kind of a pointless expansion into a country that's just not suitable just because you need to be able to sort of show that you're still growing and still going to new countries. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it'd be an expensive mistake to make, trying to scale into countries too quick and not have the right support and not think it through, and it would not be good. I love you again. I really like all these strategies, these gems that you're bringing out, of running Facebook ads as a practical step to gauge interest. I was having a conversation with some of the Partly founders, Levi and Nathan. They actually did something similar, but when they were looking for product market fit. So what they did is they ran Google ads to different versions or descriptions of what their product could do, because without actually using the product, it could potentially do anything, right? So they ran these different ads to see what gained the most traction and what resonated most with different people. And that's how they honed in on how and what they were going to solve, particularly within their problem. I don't know if you're familiar with the Partly startup, but it's kind of indexing automotive parts to buy them online is where it started, but it's gone all sorts of cool direction since then. But same thing, it's like, how can you, rather than spending 3 months, 6 months, 12 months doing like building out things and then hoping that it works, like how can you test it super quickly, get it in front of people and acid test your thinking and be comfortable to say, actually, I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, that's okay, because I've just saved a whole lot of time to know that now, opposed to later.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where we started the business. And that's where we continue to do the same thing in terms of how we deliver product to customers now. Is like, you know, we always challenge the engineering side of the business. And we kind of, what we've established in terms of a delivery model is these kind of cross-functional teams that have engineering, marketing, customer success working as kind of like a little agile team for themselves. But the challenge for them is always, what's the thinnest slice that you can deliver of this thing that will deliver some measurable contribution towards an outcome? So, you know, if they've been tasked to do is, I don't know, it could be some sort of automation task of, okay, this thing currently runs at 85% automation. We need to increase it to 90. Their job is to basically go, okay, what's the thinnest slice that will provide us value to test a hypothesis? And they might only achieve, you know, an increase in 2% over the course of 2-3 weeks, but that's totally fine because we're taking thin slices to move towards the outcome that we need, as opposed to going, how do I solve 100% of the problem right now, all in one go? And we had this conversation the other day, is that, I don't know, if you sit down and look at the next thing that you're going to build and you say, okay, there are 9 or 10 things here that I can build that will solve this problem. If you build all 10 of them and then release it and see all of the value come in, you don't actually know which of the 10 drove the most value. But if you release them one at a time and incrementally go, okay, I'll just release one, which I think was going to drive the highest value, you might actually get 90% of the value just by one of the things that you're going to deliver. But all too often people try and couple everything together and go, I have to deliver all of these things. Whereas actually just by making a tiny nudge change or a minuscule little update, you could probably get 85-90% of the value early on. And then all the rest of the work that you're doing just feels like it's pretty insignificant.
We've got clear, as you said, light bulb moment. Because it really makes things so much more practical, right? And actionable. Whereas like sometimes you can get lost, I feel, in like all the big things you need to do and the weight that comes with trying to, like, perfectionism actually becomes like the enemy of progress. Whereas it's just like, how can you do something meaningful as quickly as possible to inform yourself on whether to double down, and ultimately protect your time so you can focus on what's most meaningful. Okay, that's super cool. So your Team 27 still hiring? So anyone on the call that has the passion of helping people as well?
Yeah, come and hit us up. So we're hiring. I think we have we have a principle that for roles that we will always need, we have permanent job ads open on our website. So customer success roles, tech roles, they never come down off the website. If anyone finds it and they're thinking about, you know, from a tech perspective, being involved, yeah, come and hit us up. We've also got a bunch of roles that we're hiring for in Australia at the moment, kind of building out the team there. there. But we kind of have a policy that, if someone turns up who's got the right skills that we might need on the roadmap in 5-6 months, it's not cost effective to just let that good person go away and say, oh, come back in 6 months. We'll actually bring a role forward and say, okay, we weren't going to hire for this so soon, but actually if we've got a quality candidate, then absolutely we'll kind of open that up. So we have a pretty strong hiring roadmap. We'll probably be, by the end of this year, I think we're targeting being kind of 40 to 45 people between here and Australia, and then on from there. But if someone comes to us and it's not a role we'd considered for now and maybe one in a few months' time, but they're a standout candidate, then we'll absolutely hire earlier, because the net cost to us is not significant of 3 months worth of someone's salary for someone being good and bringing value into the business right now. In the grand scheme of things, that's not going to break the bank. It's not going to make us fall over. So it's about being flexible in terms of our own hiring plans as well, and saying, here is our hypothesis of what the hiring is going to look like, but every couple of months that could rapidly change as the needs of the business change. So we can't be, in any form of whatever we do, we can't be wedded to plans, because that's when you become too fixed into your own mindset to then see beyond that and go, actually, for the cost of 3 months' salary, we could get a really great resource in who's ready now and is keen and motivated, versus going, yeah, well, we weren't planning on doing it yet, come back in 3 months, and that won't suit you because you're not ready at that time.
And that opportunity, that person that could be a complete ace and could have really made a meaningful difference for Hnry or for the start process, and could be gone.
When you're trying to hire Navy SEALs, not an army, you have to take good people when they arrive, because they'll get snapped up. They'll go somewhere else. It's difficult because, okay, if we were just going to hire, if we just wanted like 50 engineers and we didn't really care about who they were or what they wanted or what their aspirations were, you could just go and find them, put an advert out, bring in, bodies to come and do work. But that's not how we work. So for us, it's, if someone comes to us and they look like they could be right, it's as much about, it being the right time for the potential employee as it being the right time for us, because it's a two-way transaction, right? It's not all about us holding all the power and going, you can come back when we're ready. That just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, for sure. And ultimately, it's about hiring for the right people opposed to hiring to fill a particular role. One of the things I was talking with Tokes the other day, and he was mentioning that Rod was always massive on Xero, was A's hiring A's, and it came to the same things. It was kind of like, it's about bringing the right people on that you can trust, that once they've got enough context and they have the buy-in in what you're doing, they're going to deliver, they're going to love what they do, they're going to empower other people. You don't need to micromanage them, because they are a strong member of the team that you're proud to have of the team. But rather than the other approach, right, which is like, okay, we might have just raised some extra capital, so now we're just kind of boost through this and try and get more kind of hands on deck, which I guess could be a tempting thing in that situation. But ultimately your company is the people that you bring together, right, for the product or service you're offering. So getting that right, so important.
You want people that are gonna help move things faster, right? And then one of the things that I've always talked about from a hiring strategy perspective is that, and we talk about this a lot internally, it's kind of part of our internal hiring, is when we're looking at a candidate, it's about sort of where do they sit? Are they going to be a -1, a 0, or a +1? And so a -1, for instance, is someone who is going to be actually detrimental to our culture, to the speed of the organization. They might try and take us in a different direction. They're someone who's just not going to be a good fit. They're actually going to be a detractor from what we're trying to do. And a 0 is nothing, it's nothing bad. It just means they're just going to come in and they're just going to fit. Whereas a +1 is someone who's going to come in and help make us go faster, who's going to, I kind of sometimes liken it to sort of, if you're changing the tires on a moving vehicle, your -1 is going to be the tire that slows you down and drags the car back. You've got your 0 is just a perfect fit. It's just going to slot on with the rest of the tires, continue moving at the same pace, which is fantastic. But a +1 is going to be this additive that's going to actually boost what you're doing and make you go faster as a team and bring value in and start delivering early. And so what we look for is, sometimes we'll just hire someone who's going to slot right in, which is great. But in other roles, it's like, actually, we need a +1 here. We need someone who's going to make us all better with their presence. And that's, what a great thing when you can actually turn around and go, as we have, having lived and breathed all of the roles in this business, to go, the people who do our digital marketing are way better than us. The people who do the engineering are way better than me. And actually force me to think differently about how I do stuff, because that's what happens when you hire +1s, is you get constantly challenged around your own thinking, and you have to raise your game to meet the game of your staff, which I just think is a much better way than hiring a bunch of people and then just, it's that whole thing of like, you don't hire smart people and then tell them what to do.
Love it. We've got some good questions that are coming in, James. We'll start with one, which is, did you ever go through rough patches where key people left? How did you keep your team together and keep going forward?
Yeah, I think there are always times when it gets really difficult. And I think, you know, I think there's some, I remember when Seb left, our first developer went back to France, and that was a kind of a key loss from our team. He was obviously, you know, had a huge amount of knowledge, but also he was such a part of the culture and, you know, such a part of like who we were as a business. And, you know, he kind of embodied what we looked for in Hnry staff members. Like, he didn't take himself too seriously. He didn't have an ego. He was just there to help people. He was always, you know, happy and jovial and just fun to be around, and just literally embodied everything that we had. So it was a pretty sad time with it. When he had to go, he couldn't stay, unfortunately. But yeah, we have a little picture of Seb up on our book, and everyone who turns up is convinced that he died, because like, why would you have like a little picture of your first employee? But I think, you know, it's obviously, being an engineer, there's like funny little Easter eggs that we come across where someone realizes something that he put in the code many years ago that no one's ever seen until now. But yeah, I think that culturally it's about kind of rallying around. I would say he's probably sort of key people moving on. It's about like rallying around and saying, actually, how do we move on from this? You know, where do we plug the gap? Where are the things that we can do? I think more, you know, where someone chooses to leave of their own volition, I think there's more of a sense of surprise from the people who work here, which is actually, why wouldn't someone want to work here? Like, everyone's so bought into what we're doing, and it's such a fantastic atmosphere. You know, it's unfortunate when someone has to go home for a visa reason, but other people leaving, it's like, well, why wouldn't you want to be part of something that's just absolutely flying, where you get the autonomy to do the kind of work that you want to do? So it's really about like, everyone kind of is such a tight-knit group that it just seems really strange if anyone decides to leave on their own volition.
Yeah. And we've got another question that's come through from Laura, which is, how are you planning on keeping the Australian and New Zealand teams aligned culturally? Any good learnings on that front yet?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because I think some of it's like just a really practical sense of having the kind of core values and the kind of cultural values that we've got, and the behaviors. And, you know, over the years, we have actually documented that stuff, and it feels a little bit critical, but we have, you know, this is how we interview. These are the sorts of people we look for. These are the sort of, you know, red and orange flags that we identify during the interview process. These are our values as a business. This is how we like to work. But there's no substitute for actually living and breathing that with people. So our head of Australia starts next week, and then the following week, thanks to the bubble being opened, he's actually over here for a week. I think I'll be over in Sydney for a while. I think Claire will probably come over to Sydney at some point. So part of it is about having things documented and having a culture that is easy to engage with, and that is kind of applicable in multiple markets. But some of it is actually just making sure that everyone's spending time with each other. So people who come in, because of the way we hire, we don't get people who come in who say, well, I'm going to bring my own stamp. There's people who come in who say, actually, what's the value that I can add? How can I find out more about your culture? And, you know, part of that is about, during the induction process, everyone who joins here meets everybody. They meet every single team. They shadow everyone else. They find out what people do, how they work, what they like to do, what they don't. And that's all about just making sure everyone knows who everyone else is, so that actually that culture can be nice and consistent. And you can say there's a top level set of values, but at the end of the day, if you have to actually like scribble all your values up on the wall and then point to them saying, look at this one here, it says, don't be a dick. Like, if you have to tell people that, like, you're kind of missing the point. There's, you know, values things that just as a general rule, you shouldn't be hiring anyone who needs to be told not to be a dick. But if you have a kind of set of values and behaviors that you hire for, the cultural bit kind of just aligns nicely, because you're hiring for culture first rather than skills.
That makes sense. And I guess it's something that the more you build out the team and you start to get a feel for the culture, the more someone else that's looking at coming to the team, it becomes obvious and whether you're going to be the right fit or not. So I imagine it's something that the more you do, the more obvious it becomes. Such an important thing. We've got some more questions that are flowing through, James. How do you set your product apart from competitors?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. So I think we have, because of what we do being quite unique and in a market where nothing really exists specifically that solves the problem in the same way we do. I mean, often we get compared to accounting software, but at the end of the day, accounting software is great for if you're a small business, if you're, you've got inventory or creditors or staff and those kind of things. Traditional accounting software is fantastic for that. It's been doing that for a number of years. But for your self-employed individual, our competitors are a combination of things. So, in order to kind of look at our competitor landscape, you look at maybe what people are doing if they aren't using Hnry, which is they've probably got an old school accountant combined with overblown accounting software that they're paying quite a lot for things they're not using, combined with spreadsheets, combined with internet banking. All of those things rolled into one. So we always talk about kind of almost like sort of change fatigue and apathy is our biggest competitor. People are, you like asking someone to change their mortgage provider or change banks or do anything to do with financial services. I think there's some statistics that said people are more likely to get divorced than they are to change their bank. And I think, when you work in financial services, you have to be appreciative of the fact that your competitor is not necessarily one product or the combination of like 4 different products. Your competitor is your inability to convince your customer that now is the right time to make a change. And, we talk about here, we say, well, we're not selling fidget spinners. We're very aware that this is not a $9.99 impulse buy. We have a considered buying cycle for our customers who, they need to see trust and they need to see who the team is. And so how we stand out from our competitors is about a number of different things that we do. So number one, we're not software as a service. We're not a faceless company that you don't get to speak to a human or you don't get to know who the team is. We very much put the team out front and center to say, actually, the core part of our service is still the team. The tech is great, but we delivered this business with just the team and no tech. And even though we have tech now, it's still the team that runs it. It's still the people who you can talk to on live chat or over the phone. The tech helps our lives, but from the individual's perspective, it's the core of the service is still the same as it was 3 or 4 years ago. So the differentiation from us is actually not trying to fall into that trap of distancing ourselves from the customer and saying, no, you can't phone, you can't email, we don't do support. Actually going, well, when it comes to people's money, you need to be open and transparent. And therefore that allows us to compete with this kind of mix of services that constitutes the alternative, which is, spreadsheets, accounting software, old school accountants, that kind of stuff. Particularly when you're doing something that not very many people are doing or that, not very many people are aware of. The transparency thing is the key of actually going, well, these are our people and you can come and talk to them in person or like see them on a video call or whatever it is. And that's about, that's about that kind of being more transparent than your potential competitors are.
Absolutely. And building that trust, as you say, because I mean, ultimately you're dealing with their livelihood. It's not like some, I don't mean it to diminish anything else, but it's not like an add-on service that makes someone's life a bit easier that's of good value to them. It's literally their livelihood. So having that trust that they've actually got a team that can feel super, super important. James, we've only got 2 minutes. We've got a couple of questions that have come through. So quick fire round. Can folks buy shares in Hnry and how does it all work?
So can folks buy shares in Hnry? At the moment, the shares are not publicly available. We're not using kind of snowball effect or anything like that. We will be potentially going out for another capital raise in early 2022, where there might be an opportunity for other people to invest, but that totally depends. As is last time, the rounds tend to move quite quickly, but yeah, watch this space is probably the answer to that one.
Cool. Super tactical question. How have you documented things, e.g. Notion, Confluence, Google Docs? How do you embed them deeply?
So yeah, we use Notion as like our internal wiki. We tend to stay away from Google Docs. We do use the Google Suite quite a lot, but I always find that Google Docs are kind of great if you've just got a thing that you're working on that you need to then shove out the door to someone else. But actually, we prefer the knowledge to live in things like Notion. We use Monday.com for all of our task planning, but we didn't start on that. So it's a constantly evolving beast. We started off with, a glass wall covered in Post-its, and then that became, inefficient. So it's about constantly evolving the tools that you use and never getting so wedded to one tool that you couldn't sort of migrate off it tomorrow and still have the knowledge retained. Like there's so much information there, but we can't be, particularly if you're entering into any kind of negotiation with suppliers, you can't be so wedded to a single tool that you're not able to then come off it at some point.
I like that. Cool. And James, final words that you may have for the community and the folks listening.
I had to think about this because I knew you were going to ask this question, and I think that the thing that I was thinking about this morning is just about resilience, and I think that it's such an important thing that, you know, and you and I were talking before the call about the kind of startup community in general, and there's like huge amounts of support, but there's also a certain side to whatever anyone does where there will always be people who are critical of what you do and how you do it. There will always be people if, you know, I remember, you know, we put a job ad out in 2018 on one of the Facebook groups, and all we were looking for was someone to come and work for us. And we got a slew of people kind of critiquing our business model and our idea and, you know, what we do and how we do it. And it's like, I was just looking for someone who might be interested to work here. Like there will always be opinion from people. And, you know, it's almost kind of, if you're in this world, getting very used to the fact that there are going to be people who are not going to like what you're doing, whether they might be your competitors or whether they might be potential customers or investors. There will always be people who will take a negative slant. And it can be, you know, it can be hard in the very early days to kind of rise above that. I remember on the night of the demo day of the FinTech Accelerator, I got told by a friend that after all of the pitches, he'd asked this friend of his, who's a very prominent member of the NZ tech community, who is your pick as, you know, a business to watch out for? And I can't remember who he said, but it wasn't us. And my friend said, oh, what do you think of Hnry? And he said, oh, really not fussed. That looks like the kind of thing that someone could build in a weekend. And, you know, to hear that from someone who is very well respected and is often in the media commenting on tech, to hear from them that Hnry was nothing special and that, you know, could be done in a weekend, you know, you have to rise above that stuff and go, you know, you try not to take an arrogant slant, but you're going, actually, perhaps I've got more information about how this market works than so-called kind of, you know, tech entrepreneurs or whoever. And I haven't spoken to that person in person. I've just kind of got the information of what he said at the time, but it's kind of stuck with me as something that, like, well, there will always be people who look at what you do and do not enjoy what you bring to the market or do not think it's anything worth pursuing. But that shouldn't be a reason to let that dissuade you. You should always be guided by your customers and your market and what people ask for and the reactions and the feedback that you get from people who use the service. And look, anything that you create is not going to be for everyone. There will always be people who say, that's not for me. And we just go,
and that's okay.
It's okay for this not to be for everyone. Like, that's not our plan here. But for those people who need it and we can give some value to, like, that's why it's there. And as long as there are people out there who enjoy what you do and enjoy using the product, then that's the thing that makes the difference. Like, there will always be people who are kind of like, I don't understand why anyone would do this, you know, and you're like, that's great. It's not for you. And it's just, you've got to move on. But I think it's, yeah, the resilience thing is something we had to learn really early on, was actually, and I think there was a Twitter post the other day that someone put up that's like, might have even been on the NZ Tech Startups ecosystem, my favorite Facebook group, that someone put up this Twitter post that someone said, if you want to know what it's like to be a founder, just imagine getting, you know, being slated for 24 hours straight by the internet. And that's what it's like to be a founder, is just constantly having to deal with people criticizing and wanting to kind of, you know, give you their 2 cents. And I think, you know, having the resilience to get through that is probably the most critical thing, particularly in those early stages.
That's super powerful, man. Very, very deep. I'm going to re-listen to that piece, because, and I love how you also tie it to like your internal resilience, but also getting the feedback from your customers. Again, that theme coming through, because if you're adding value to someone over here, it's okay for a person over there to not get it and not like it, because you are adding value. And as you say, it doesn't have to be for everyone, but that resilience piece, stay strong, surround yourself with the people that do get it. And people that do believe in the mission.
Listen, you've got to make sure you celebrate all those wins. You know, we have a dedicated wins channel on Slack, and when we get nice or when something happens that's of note, that even could just be a good meeting, or, you know, something has been successful, or some statistics look like they're going well, we encourage people to just chuck it on the wins channel. And then every Friday we review all of the wins of the week with the entire team, and we sit there and say, here are the wins for the week. And yeah, there'll always be, you know, during the week, someone who says, oh, I don't like the layout of your invoices. And you go, great, invoicing is optional. Don't use it if you don't like it. But, you know, when you can actually see the wins where people are like, holy crap, where have you been all my life? You know, I love this team. I love this service. This has genuinely helped me. Like, as a team, that's why we do it. You know, we're not doing it to try and convince the haters otherwise. We're doing it for the people who are out there going, I'm struggling. I need help with my taxes. we can help those people and we can actually bring some real value. And so we have to celebrate as a team constantly those tiny little wins, because that's like why we're all on this journey. You know, it's not about the necessarily the big milestones. It's just about the kind of great feedback you get from people and the sort of positivity that comes from hearing people get benefit from what you're doing.
Love it. James, thank you so much for jumping on this. It's been absolutely filled with gems. Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Fascinating journey. Thanks everyone as well for tuning in, and we'll talk soon. Cheers,
Awesome.
James.
Thanks. Cheers.